Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back President and CEO, iNACOL, Susan Patrick.
Good morning. Are you ready for day 2? Woo! All right, let's go. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to day 2 of the iNACOL Symposium 2018. Before I introduce the speaker this morning, I'd just like to give a little bit background of the organization where he spent his career. How many people are familiar with the OECD? Great. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an organization that started several decades ago with 36 member countries leading democracies. It's based out of Paris. It's where I spent part of my Eisenhower Fellowship. And the organization itself is designed to compare policies and identify good practices. It's looking at important topics on future-focused issues that are critical for advancing a good society. So in the spirit, for all of us, as we're thinking about transforming education, and that maxim of think globally and act locally, this applies to education as well. So today I'm honored to present a keynote speaker on the topic, thinking about if you've ever wished to spend an hour sort of on a magic carpet ride, looking and studying promising practice on innovative learning environments around the world, David Istance is the person that you want alongside you, sharing what is happening in different places, connecting it, building frameworks. His work and body of knowledge is unprecedented in my opinion, and I'm so grateful that he's here to join us today. So on this topic of educational innovation, he really is one of the leading experts from anywhere across the globe to help us learn and push our thinking. So without further ado, let me share with you David Istance. He headed the Schooling for Tomorrow project at the OECD's Center for Education Research and Innovation. For a decade before leading another of its long-running programs, Innovative Learning Environments, and its follow-up program, Innovative Pedagogies for Powerful Learning. This work has spanned systems change and future thinking through local strategies and innovations to research and practice on teaching and learning. Creating synthesis and new frameworks has been as important as reporting on specific innovations. David held the main pen in these international projects, looking to provide intellectual leadership as well as promoting the innovations of others. He has privileged the practical relevance and accessibility of knowledge. For instance, his 2017 book, Innovative Learning Environments, the handbook, aimed precisely at educational practitioners and leaders. He has since co-authored Teachers as Designers of Learning Environments, The Importance of Innovative Pedagogies, published by OECD this year in 2018. Equity and lifelong learning have been inspiring themes throughout his work, and he has recently focused his attention on aging and learning by seniors. David retired from the OECD mid-2017 and is now a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and a visiting professor at Strathclyde University in Scotland. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to David Istance.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you, Susan, for those kind words, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address such a community of committed, innovative educators, and talk about what's quite a large body of work that we've undertaken over the past 10, 12 years at the OECD. It's a privilege to be able to reflect on that work as a whole, rather than particular aspects of it. And though I retired from the OECD last year, we were, as Susan said, we were finishing up the work on pedagogies this year, so that's what I want to talk about. So here's what I really want to talk about over the next 45 minutes or so. What we did and why we did it, the learning principles that emerged from the early part of the work. We published a report about 8 years ago that was very much about learning. Developed a framework called the 7+3 framework, which I'll present in some detail. And then talk something about, particularly in line with the theme of the conference on transformation, system change, and then come back to some of the key messages. I've put up there that body of work. Those are published reports. Some are quite short reports, about 90 pages. Some of them are quite substantial 350-page reports, like the nature of learning. I've put them up to give you a clue as to what's lying behind this, the frameworks, but also because it represents a philosophy as well as just a series of vaguely connected reports. It's not just a project I'm describing. I think it's more than that. Because when we were framing this before the first strand about learning, that's when we decided that we really did have to found this work on a profound understanding of the nature of learning, rather than move immediately into looking at innovations without necessarily a foundation on which to base that in terms of how do we really learn best. We, of course, did want to look, as we did, at a variety of examples, illustrative, different, interesting, inspiring examples. The key area of leadership. But then, not to stop there, not to say, well, here's some interesting examples, go off and propagate, but to think about how can we grow and sustain innovative learning environments in different settings, what kinds of models, what kinds of examples are there, and as Susan mentioned, to bring that all together in what we called the handbook last year, which is contains a series of tools, really, for different innovators, educators to do it for themselves, which is actually the whole point of this exercise, or has been over that period of time. In doing that, those three strands, the learning, the innovative cases, and the implementation and transformation, we realized that there were sort of two areas that we were weaker on, but which had emerged as key. One was, we talked a lot about innovating the pedagogical core, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but we hadn't actually focused on innovative pedagogies themselves. And so that was the final project that we've done over the last 2 or 3 years. In doing that, in doing the work on transformation and implementation, the key role of networks just emerged very powerfully as a vehicle for transformation. Not the only one, but absolutely fundamental. And in looking at pedagogies, we looked especially and identified a variety of networks, some large ones, some relatively small local ones, that were themselves very focused on pedagogies and innovative pedagogies. So that gives you a sense of the thinking behind this design, but also perhaps to stress that because the one strand led to another, because the learning work was the foundation on which we built the innovative cases, and we developed out of those cases the framework, and then we looked at implementation and went back to look at pedagogy and networks. A point to stress, I think, is that we quite often in our work tend to do one thing and then move on to the next thing and finish that and then move on to the next thing. I think we had the privilege at OECD of saying we're actually going to build something that is cumulative and to try and base our next phase of work on what we did before. And I think that's and we had the luxury of being able to do that, but I think that's something that's quite important for us. Now, I've put up a list of reasons, I think, why we must be deeply concerned about innovating teaching and learning. Some of them are very familiar, but I've put them up because narratives are extremely important. We know that. We can see it around us all the time, even turning on the TV and the news. Narratives are very, very important. And in education, we tend not to be so good at narrative, of thinking through the narrative and thinking through the other narrative, the one that perhaps we're looking to replace, transform, and change. So I think the reasons why we want to innovate are actually quite important to underline. And I wasn't going to talk much about this, but the more I thought about it and the power of narrative, the more important I think it is to address these points. Some of them are familiar. The first and the third one, I think, are the very familiar ones. Doesn't make them any less important. In fact, they're familiar because they're so important. We live in rapidly changing societies and economies, and there are very stubborn equity issues, problems of lower attainment that seem very hard to move, and disengagement by learners. Those, if we think we can deal with those two without innovating, then we've got another thing coming. But I think there are some other parts to the narrative. The second point, the rising ambition. We are actually pushing the bar up. I was very pleased to hear yesterday about the very strong focus on equity, the very strong, the very important step to move away from thinking that somehow quality and equity are somehow two vaguely connected things, whereas of course they're not vaguely connected at all. They're absolutely integral. And as we put the bar up, the more we think about lifelong learning, the more we think about change and flexibility, we're actually challenging ourselves in education systems to innovate. They go together, it seems to me. You cannot do it the old way. A lot of the old ways may be valuable, but we can't be stuck in an old ways thinking. We must be, I think, constantly innovating and being ready to innovate. The last 2 points are perhaps less familiar or less part of the narrative, but I think are actually quite important parts of the narrative. That is that the more we know about the nature of learning, what works, engagement, the more it suggests that we need to have complex, innovative pedagogies, approaches, learning environments that are not at all like the sort of stereotyped caricature of what traditional education is about. And many of the ideas that have been around, certainly through alternative education for a long time in terms of engagement, active learning, and so on, they were ahead of the research game. The research has, in a sense, caught up with that to show that these are very powerful aspects of better learning. So I think the research, some of which I'll refer to in a moment, supports that. But so does, I think, the ambition of creating and sustaining a dynamic teaching profession. That is, if we want to be attractive as a teaching profession, I think part of that is to have models, collaborative models, demanding models of teaching and learning that are truly professional. So I think we can make a connection between the nature of the teaching profession, and a direct connection between the nature of the teaching profession as a profession and the kinds of innovations that we're talking about in the aspiration to innovate teaching and learning. That begs the question what I understand innovation to be and what we have used as our understanding of innovation. And I won't spend a lot of time on it, but just to say that we've used a very broad understanding of what innovation is. Something very sensitive to context, not a one formula, this is what innovation is. Something that's broad and flexible. And that little quote about fresh approaches to long-standing challenges, innovation as that, in a spirit of disciplined experimentation, innovation necessarily involving experimentation, but disciplined. That seems to me to capture quite well what innovation is, and therefore not some of those things that are frequently associated with innovation. They might be, by happenstance, accidentally, those aspects may come in, but not to think of innovation as it's got to be something new. It has to necessarily involve digital technology. It very often will, but it doesn't necessarily. And it's not necessarily through looking at saying, oh, well, what's an innovative practice over here and what's an uninnovative practice over there? That's kind of not how I see it at all. I think sometimes a practice may be very innovative in one context and not in another. And certainly not the idea of the 1,000 flowers blooming, which is, just to let things happen and hope for the best. And sometimes you get something great and sometimes it doesn't work. That notion of disciplined experimentation, I think, means we're not really talking about just everyone just giving it a go. So I want to talk about some of the core frameworks. And this was the set of principles that emerged from the work on the nature of learning. We'd got brilliant learning scientists and educational researchers to write a set of contributory papers with a focus on design. What does that mean for the design of learning environments? But we got to the end and said, well, we can't leave it there. We do need to think of a set of synthetic principles, conclusions that really cut right across these different contributions and which sum up the principles of learning that should be underpinning our designs. And we came up with 7. The first one, and some of them might seem fairly sort of obvious, I think the demanding nature of these principles is that we think all of them are important. In other words, it's not like we'll choose number 1 and number 3, and then number 6. But it's demanding, I think, because we're talking about a comprehensive set of learning principles, and there they are. The first one is very much about putting learning at the center as a design principle, encouraging engagement. Very hard to think of how we're going to improve, innovate teaching and learning if learners are disengaged. So engagement absolutely central, and that idea that learners should come to understand themselves as learners, that whole metacognitive piece. The importance of seeing learning as something social and often collaborative, not always, but often collaborative, I think is important not only because that is what learning is, it is social, but because it goes against a common idea that learning is something rather private and which goes on inside each person's head. That the idea that learning is something that depends upon interaction and depends upon a social environment is, I think, an important point to underpin and underline. And the third point, similarly, perhaps less obvious, the point about the importance of emotions. And this is not about being nice. We must be nice to students. It's not that point, although, of course, that's perfectly important that we are nice to students. We know this isn't an advocacy of being unkind to students, but it's not a point about being more empathetic. It's really to come to grips with the fact that cognitive learning and emotions are two sides of the same coin. Enthusiasm, engagement, satisfaction, or on the other side, negatively, frustration, being lost, being shamed. That emotional side is absolutely integral to the power and effectiveness of learning. Those next 2 points about being really attuned to and sensitive to individual difference came through very strongly through the chapters. I think it's very demanding. It's all about personalization that your whole conference is about. It's very difficult sometimes to develop those organizational models that really builds on that, but it is absolutely critical. And similarly, that fifth principle about being demanding for all learners, but without excessive overload, without thinking that to improve teaching and learning, we should be cramming in some sense. It's not about cramming, but it is about demanding learning regimes that really test all learners, those who are finding it relatively easy and those that are struggling. And both of those need to be engaged. That point about connectedness, I'm not sure if connectedness is a word in the dictionary. We kind of made it up. But you can guess what it means. It's perhaps one of the most important they're all important, but that's a very important one of our principles, that you really need to promote connection across the different learning episodes and the broader concepts, connection across the domains of learning, and connection between the learning that goes on in school and out of school, in education, if you like, and outside, in the different sites. And that, of course, connects to many of the themes that you're experts in. And then, and this came up yesterday as well in the keynote, the importance of using assessments that really are consistent with these different aims and principles, with a strong emphasis on formative feedback. But the assessments should really be consistent with what we're really trying to do to make learning powerful. They're all needed, and that's why I think that's actually quite a radical agenda, even if each one of them might seem fairly familiar. But the challenge is, I think, that they are all needed, and yet we need to be strategic and we need focus. So how do you get into the 7 through perhaps a focus on 1 or 2 of those to open up learning? So that, I think, is one of the, educationally, one of the major challenges. Having completed a review of learning sciences, we then looked at about 125 different cases. They were submitted by systems in about over 20 countries, 25 systems, and of which of about 125, 40 were developed into full case studies. Michael Fullen was kind enough to write that endorsement of the book that we did on the basis of the synthesis, if you like, of those cases. But what was, I think, valuable about that work was not simply to say, well, here's another innovation. Oh, here's another one. Oh, this is a good one over here. In other words, sort of saying, well, there's lots and lots of interesting stuff out there. Read it and hopefully you'll be inspired. But we wanted to take them as a whole and think, well, what do we see? What framework can we think of to help us understand what these different cases are? And so we came up with what we called the 7+3, and then we used it in that report, the framework, to present the detail of those different examples. And that's the framework that we came up with. That at the core were those 7 learning principles, the ones that we'd already identified, that should inform design throughout. Those are the general design principles. But in order to make it happen, there are those three dimensions, and they're not equal, because I think we put them in that order because at the core, what we're thinking of in order to really put those learning principles into place is we really must innovate the pedagogical core. And I'll explain in a minute what I mean by that. We must think of engaging in learning leadership, which will really impact that pedagogical core. So that's why we put them in that order, in a formative way. That notion of innovation as disciplined experimentation, it should be a formative process. The evidence of learning feeding back into leadership and design decisions, and coming back and rethinking, tweaking, seriously rethinking, and so on. That leadership, that learning leadership, is critical. And that partnerships are very important. In other words, to think outside of what are often the traditional boundaries of educational institutions. Of course, many schools do that already. We were focused particularly, I should say, on sort of school-aged children and young people, but some of these ideas and research principles are not restricted only to that, but we were thinking especially about school-age learners. And the partnerships should really feed back. If they're going to be really effective, they're going to impact both on the pedagogical core and, in some sense, the leadership. So that's the framework. So each one should contribute to those, if you like, above. And we think it's a framework, although we developed it in relation to individual learning environments, you can think of it as a framework, I'll show that in a moment, that can apply also to schools, districts, and even whole systems. So let me say a bit more about pedagogy. Said already that we had identified that as critical to the whole innovation effort, the innovation endeavor, but also we came back to it because we felt we were weak in understanding what some of those pedagogies are. That's half of what we meant by the pedagogical core, that we were thinking of it in terms of the elements, in terms of very simple way of thinking, that it's about educators, many of them qualified teachers, but other educators too, including other students, the learners, and those may be in some sense given, but not always. Some of our cases had mothers working and learning alongside their children, for example. The resources, and thinking there particularly about learning resources, which is something, of course, central to all your work. What kinds of learning resources should we have or should we be using? And content. The knowledge, the values, the competencies, absolutely critical. So those are the elements, and we saw in our different cases innovations in all those elements. They were part of it. But it's also the dynamics. It's how do these, and this is where pedagogy, as the connection between those four elements, how do they work? What are the dynamics? And we thought, again, in terms of four. The pedagogies themselves, the way in which learners are grouped in different ways, sometimes learning by themselves, sometimes in lecture mode, sometimes in classrooms, group learning, and so on. What are the innovations? What kinds of groupings of students and learners are really we should be thinking about in terms of making the changes that we're looking at? And the same, and very importantly, for teachers. And not to be stuck with the idea that teachers have to be working by themselves and in the old caricature stereotype with the door closed and no one else really knowing what that individual teacher is doing. How are teachers working together, their learning, in their planning, their collaboration, the actual teaching itself? And the use of time. The keynote yesterday lunchtime put up I can't remember exactly what the formula was, but it had, times 30, times 2, times whatever, In other words, what is the kinds of learning time, how can we rethink that in ways that are really helpful for advancing what we're trying to do. I think this area is an absolutely critical one because pedagogy, as far as I can see, is both at the heart of the matter of teaching and learning, and yet is the least visible of the things that we have. The least visible of the aspects of the educational system for all sorts of reasons, and we can think what some of those are. So that's actually itself quite a challenge, and I think quite a worrying characteristic. Pedagogy is really about how we think about teachers and learners interacting with content and with resources. It's at the heart of teaching and learning. If there's no change in the teaching and learning, all the other aspects, all of which are important, the resourcing, the organization, very important, but they're important to make teaching and learning happen and be more powerful. And I think that pedagogical expertise, and I suppose I'd say and design expertise, lie at the heart of teacher professionalism. And is critical, as I said at the beginning, as our ambitions grow, critical to that. And I'll explain why in a moment. And yet it's something very hard to grasp. It's partly because of it's happening in so many different forms, in so many different ways. And it's not easy to sum up in policy terms. Policies are not really about pedagogies. So it's all very indirect. So it's hard to grasp. But even, and I think that's a sort of also one of those kind of worrying points, even teachers themselves often find it difficult to talk about their own teaching, their own practice. We found when we were surveyed the innovative learning environments in the middle part of this work, we found that the actual teaching and learning was the aspect that was least in evidence. That was what we were trying to get at, but that was what the people surveyed, the principals, the lead teachers, and so on, actually found it quite difficult to talk about that, as opposed to things like funding, student intake, and so on, curricular policies, testing, and so on. All those things, people are much more comfortable about those aspects than about the teaching and learning and the pedagogy. And I think, too, pedagogy becomes even more important because of the changing ideas about curriculum. As increasingly we're thinking around the world of curriculum, not in relatively traditional terms as domains of knowledge to be in some sense transmitted or imparted or covered, but we're being more and more demanding in terms of particular competencies. And what's more, those competencies are not the same. If we're thinking of persistence, if we're thinking about creativity, curiosity, teamwork, these are not the same things. And so therefore, the pedagogical impact will be different. And the reason why I think pedagogy is so important to competence and mastery and deep learning is because it has to be in some sense modeled through and developed through the actual teaching and learning that's going on, rather than somehow an accidental that comes out of a particular way in which we organize teaching and our programs. So I think pedagogy becomes much more directly central the more we're trying to think in terms of developing these ambitious and diverse competencies. And yet even more challenging is the fact that we can't think of this in terms of competencies versus content, or competencies as opposed to substance. You actually need to have that content and substance in order to develop these the deep learning and the profound capacity to be creative, persistent, to involve teamwork and so on. It needs to be on the basis of content, not something that you do instead. So I think that is an important point to stress. We thought, rather than look at lots and lots of different teaching methods, it would be important to think in terms of what are clusters and families of what you might call innovative pedagogies. Many of them are not, of course, innovative in the sense of new. Many of them have been part of the repertoire of teachers and schools through history. But nevertheless, they may well be innovative in terms of standard models of how we think a classroom should be, a school should be, or learning that's going on outside of conventional educational institutions. And those are the 6 families that we came up with. And they're not sort of meant to be, they're meant to be in the middle, really, between more general theories of learning, things like group learning, which are part of all those things, and very specific teaching methods. We wanted to have clusters to help us think through what are we actually talking about when we're looking at pedagogy. And we came up with those 6. Blended learning, you're very, very familiar with, about rethinking routines and ways of organizing, using digital resources very powerfully. Games, the pedagogical power of games and play, and using aspects like progress, like feedback, like collaboration, competition, and so on, through games, and using games seriously in learning. Computational thinking, drawing on the way in which computers can address problems, and then using computers to solve those problems, and think of coding and programming as a kind of a whole literacy in itself, rather than simply as a means to an end. Experiential learning, that we used rather broadly to mean the using experience, observation, and a reflection as a very integral part of the pedagogy, and includes things like inquiry-based and service learning. But experiential learning, embodied learning, which has a sense beyond, if you like, the cognitive, to include the emotional, to include the artistic sides of us as human beings, and to think of those embodied in the learning very centrally, in some cases through sport or through arts or through tinkering. And that rather mouthful, this wasn't my choice of title, but my young colleague wanted a very accurate title, but to think in terms of pedagogies which depend upon questioning our given structures of knowledge, those pedagogies which are very much discussion-based and which create distance and cultural distance, questioning distance to our accepted domains of learning and knowledge. So in those 6, we think we have a way of thinking through what some of those pedagogies are, rather than having just saying, well, we're interested in adopting innovative pedagogies. And I think that the focus on pedagogy is so important, because the more that we innovate away from established schools and learning environment settings, the more I think we have to think about pedagogy. So it's, again, one of those very challenging aspects of this work. The more we're saying anytime, anywhere, the question then is, well, what kinds of pedagogies are we creating, and how do we ensure that there is really powerful learning going on, and not just leaving it to happenstance? We thought of those clusters in terms of, I've said already, the importance of context to definitions of innovation, but we thought in terms of a set of C's, which we used as prisms to look at those different pedagogies. In terms of, and often, instead of looking at each one by one, or methods one by one, and being sort of in a very fragmented sort of effect size way of thinking, to know that, of course, pedagogies are used in combination. So combination, very important, but also connoisseurship. We used it partly because I'm obsessed with finding words that begin with the same letter. And connoisseurship was the best we came up with. Competence sounded a little bit bland. But what there to say that it really matters doing it well. And that's where I think there's a big research agenda to really dig in and really find out what do you really need to do these things well, as opposed to doing things in the name of. And we know that, for example, in formative assessment, a great deal has been done in the name of assessment for learning, but which is rather weak and not very effective. So the notion of connoisseurship, but also sensitivity to context and content. Are there particular pedagogies for particular knowledge and skills? And there are. And particularly if we're thinking of those 21st century competencies, often so called. A further point that we came to in commissioning papers, and this is particularly looking at those that we commissioned from Amelia Peterson at Harvard, or she was at Harvard, was the notion of anchoring, of there being a limited set of pedagogies, of thinking of anchoring teaching in not trying to do everything, of there being a restricted set that offer clarity, coherence, teachers know where they are, learners know where they are, and that there's some of those organizational dilemmas can get resolved because we're not trying to do everything, but we're actually focusing, providing focus. And so that is, I think, part of the whole challenge, both in looking at those learning principles, but also here, is to think what is that focus, what is that strategic focus. That means we're not really trying to do everything. And in this case, I really think we are looking at not trying to do everything. Leadership, I won't dwell on this, that's our pedagogical core. And just to say that our meaning of it as a formative cycle was that there really ought to be that circle, that evidence circle from design through gathering of that evidence, through feedback, and a design, redesign cycle. That's what we meant by that. I won't dwell on that, but that's how we formulated it. The more that we worked, you'll see already at the bottom that I've changed from 4 Ds to 5 Ds. I'm just obsessed with Cs and Ds and all that kind of stuff. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. But to say that we thought of learning leadership as critical in terms of creating the conditions for the kind of learning that we're trying to, if you like, 21st century learning. It's very much about making changes in that pedagogical core. It's multi-level. Of course, it happens. Leadership is very relevant in school institutions, but leadership is very relevant in the whole variety of levels and settings. And levels, by levels, I don't just mean, I'll come to that in a moment if I've got time. And not just thinking of, are we talking about the district or are we thinking about the school, but very importantly, what we call the meso level, which is very much about networks. And leadership in networks, for example, you as a network and the networks within the network, I think we're less clear about leadership, models of leadership, research on leadership in those different settings, in the more complex learning environments and ecosystems that we're operating in, than we are in the more straightforward setting of the school with the school principal and so on. But this is not in any way to say school principals aren't important. They're absolutely central. If things often just cannot happen if the school principal is not on side. And then there's these Ds, so you see I've added one in, trying to think of leadership not as characteristics of leaders, which is very tied to context, but the functions of leadership themselves. And I formulated that in terms of 5. The drive, leadership is providing drive, and we see a lot of that, for example, with you, as driving change. The diagnosis part, I don't know why I left that out at the beginning, the really being able to understand what's happening and to diagnose the real challenges and the real ways through, providing direction, the design, the word that I've used so many times, and then the dialogue that comes with that necessarily if it's actually going to happen. And then partnerships. I'm going to have to move on because I'm kind of right towards the end of my time. But partnerships, we saw in those different cases many different forms. And of course, some of those key partnerships are partnerships with other schools, networking and so on, and with the different organization. The partnerships, I think, become the more powerful when they really are influencing learning leadership and the pedagogical core, as opposed to being somehow on the periphery. And therefore, a key role of leadership is to really choose partners strategically and carefully. And perhaps it is another case of quality rather than quantity. I'm going to put up very quickly, since I am running right out of time, in the work on transformation and change at a more systemic level or a higher level, we thought of what might a learning system that was characterized by 7+3, what might it look like? And those were some of the things that we really thought, if you could see those, if you could see high learning activity and motivation, if you could see active educator collaboration, if you could see learner agency, if you could see interdisciplinary work and development of new materials, you could see that digital resources were being used powerfully and right across the board. If there were new and more comprehensive assessment metrics, and partnerships, and I'll just stop on just a moment on the meso level. We thought that is really critical, and actually that's where the change comes from. Not thinking of you've either got the individual teacher in school over here or a system over here, but it's actually through that middle level. And I'll put that up quickly because this is how we kind of try to characterize it visually as a weakly connected learning system. Across the bottom, the formal school on the right-hand side, the sort of hybrids of the formal and non-formal, and the non-formal on the left-hand side, and then those levels from classrooms up through schools, district systems, and so on. A weakly connected learning system, we thought you'd have a lot of units, if you like, up and down in that right-hand column, as opposed to thinking of a learning system, much of which is not visible in any formal description of our school systems, in those networks, those communities of practice that connect up different educators, different communities, and so on. So that was our way of trying to think of that, but it's not just that there's more networking, but that there's a shift, if you like, a horizontal shift towards those hybrids and towards the non-formal programs and organizations. So key messages. The whole point about narrative, I think, would be, perhaps a message above all the others. Why innovation is imperative, and to think through and counter, if you like, the narrative that innovation is something that you get to when you've done the serious business of teaching and organizing schooling. Innovation is an integral part of the core business of our education systems, with learning at the center. We found, I think, the 7+3 framework to be powerful. It helps to connect parts. It helps to think through not only the key elements, but how they connect up, and to think of the value of frameworks in general. I think that's a lot of our work has been about developing frameworks. The point about pedagogical expertise is absolutely central to teacher professionalism. To my mind, that is an area that is ripe for more and more work and clarity, and getting away from the invisibility of teachers' work, of teaching and learning, which dogs our education systems. The focus on competencies, I think, really emphasizes the nature of the pedagogies that we're using in schools, out of schools, in our teaching and learning, that it's been easy, relatively easy to say, to rewrite curricula and say we're now thinking in terms of demanding new competencies. Quite another matter, I think, then to match that with a corresponding focus on the models and the nature, the relationships of teaching and learning that put those into practice. And one of our challenges, I think, is that some of these frameworks are actually very demanding. The principles are demanding, the frameworks are demanding, and they're much more demanding than much simpler organizational models. And as the learning environments themselves become more complex, so do things like leadership, change, also become, I think, more complex, hence to be addressed. Those D's of leadership absolutely critical if we're going to make change happen. The importance of focus and design and anchor and holistic environments. And just to say that I think that a lot of what I've presented is a challenge to what can be a way of thinking could be part of the anytime, anywhere idea, that we fragment everything and leave it's up to students, it's up to individual educators to kind of do what they want to do by themselves. I think a lot of this depends on collaboration, of working together, joint leadership, distributed leadership, flexibility, design, redesign. All that is collaborative. So we're not making the contrast between being more flexible and being more individualistic and being much more fragmented. The possibility of thinking of new indicators that might actually tell us how we're doing across whole systems in terms of those kind of 7+3, and the key role of what we've called the meso level of networks, communities of practice, and multi-level learning leadership, including governments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. I appreciate that. We're gonna do a quick summary and wrap up here with a few questions. And let me just say, I would love to follow up after the symposium and talk to you more about this idea of new indicators for policy and systems that really look at the whole across the system. So I will make a note for us to get together when you're back at Brookings. So leaning in, there's one area in particular that I think helps tie all of this together, and you can see from the frameworks, from the research on how students learn best, from the focus on innovative pedagogies, and tying this together, and the ideas around this curriculum redesign, when you start to see interdisciplinary approaches getting into the deeper learning side. When you showed that meso level slide and this idea of when the learning activities take place within school buildings, within classrooms, and then start to go into the partnerships, and we heard Tony and Carlos and Phyllis talk about this yesterday. I'm wondering, when it moves into those partnerships and students have these powerful learning experiences, in the US, we're so dogged by seat time. And even when we have the flexibility to move from seat time, how does that credit come back to a student? And how does the teacher evaluate that work? So, how are your frameworks useful for educators and the deeper implications for pedagogy? But when you see that big idea on the meso, how does that come back in to a student as they move through?
Well, that's a huge question. I mean, how do the first part of the question, how do the frameworks work?
Right, so how are your frameworks useful for educators as they're looking at that and kind of tying it all together? Yeah. The pedagogy changes when you start having students building these learning experiences, co-designing with teachers and leaders in the school
Well,
outside.
I think the frameworks are there precisely for that reason, to give comprehensive hooks on which to hang a lot of what we're trying to do in perhaps rather disparate ways, to not lose sight of what we're, to think holistically and to bring things together. And the frameworks such as those 7 learning principles that were developed through research to see how they actually work in practice is, I think, to have those frameworks there in terms of engagement, in terms of the importance of the emotional, the personalization, the assessment, and the connectedness. So I think the value of frameworks is precisely, of course, they mightn't be very good frameworks, but in this case, we think, because we've developed them carefully through a combination of researchers, educators, policy people, and they've been tried out in different places, more in some than others, but I think there's a robustness to them that I hope is of value. Now, the second part of the question is, how do you bring it back to the learner? How does that? Well, I think that is if you are focusing on the nature of learning. I mean, that is a big difference. It seems a strange thing to say, but in quite a lot of our school systems, that first principle, make learning central, a lot of people, including in the teaching profession, have said and lamented the fact that often the learning is not at the center. And therefore, because of the demands, the organizational demands, of forgetting, if you like, the cart and the horse, of forgetting what is the real priority, and that some of the other aspects, which are very important, the managing of organizations and systems and so on, that they're in the service of the learning rather than the other way around. Those pedagogies, which are very much about active learning, agency, inquiry, embodied learning, those are powerful because they really are engaging and activating learning among young people themselves. So I think the frameworks themselves have put the learner to the center, and learning, I should say, but the learner and learning and learners collectively, recognize the importance of educators and teachers. And just as sort of almost an aside, in education, we're often dogged by a very binary way of thinking, that we think if we have more of one thing, means we have less of another. And often the putting such a focus on learning can be interpreted as meaning we're less interested in teaching. Mm-hmm. And that seems to me a totally false a comparison. And if you don't have scaffolding, if you don't have good teaching, if you don't have powerful pedagogy, then you are not doing what you can to really engage and develop learning.
I love just a side note. In New Zealand, the word ako, the Maori word ako, is the same for teaching and learning. They don't have separate words, and that's something to bring to heart as we're thinking about how to approach this, and seeing the visibility of learning how to learn apparent in innovative classrooms around the world is, as students are going deep into building content knowledge and skills, they're actively developing all of these strategies and the learning how to learn and go through that productive struggle. So how do you advise using your frameworks for thinking differently about professional learning? I see so much value in, as we're trying to personalize learning and build competency-based systems, we're recognizing, those look-fors, we're doing some of that, but we really need to focus more on student agency. And what does that mean for us, for how we think about professional learning differently?
Well, I think the seeing innovation as fresh approaches to long-standing challenges through disciplined experimentation, that essentially describes a learning agenda. It doesn't make any sense to me unless there's powerful learning about what's going on, what might happen, what we could do together, what we're aiming for. That is a powerful learning process involved, even in thinking through what innovation might be. But the focus that we've put on the formative nature of learning environments, leadership, and so on, means that it's based on knowledge and evidence. And if knowledge is not knowledge unless there's learning. It's merely data or information. So those models, those frameworks assume powerful learning. The whole tenor, I think, of those frameworks and the conclusions that we came to assume very powerful collaboration. And I think the collaborative idea of professional learning is a very comes through very strongly. So the collaboration, those challenges that I was trying to outline, I think, about the invisibility of pedagogy, is an area, so not so much the process of professional learning, but the actual direction of what we need to learn about. There's a very large agenda, I think, to think that one through. What are the pedagogies and how are they appropriate for different students, different aims, different ambitions that we might have? But the question then arises, well, how can we do that? And what kinds of ways of organizing that? I mean, partly, of course, it is through the collaborative nature of teachers and educators and school communities and then the wider community working together. But I would come back to the importance of the meso-level and networks and bodies like yourself. The networking is a very important, not only vehicle for professional learning, but it can also be, as with those networks that we surveyed as part of the most recent work, that's a core mission for them, is to ensure that the members of the networks actually understand what different possibilities there are to put particular pedagogical approaches in place. So I think I would emphasize the role of the communities of practice, networking, and so on, and the learning leadership as requiring learning.
Thank you. I think that's a beautiful place to wrap up our morning plenary session. And we are all learners, all going through this process of challenging ourselves and innovating to have learning environments that best meet the needs of the future. So please join me in thanking David Istance this morning. Thank you so much for being here with us.
My pleasure.
Great. Well, enjoy your sessions this morning, and we'll see you back here for the luncheon with the student panel. Thank you.